I decided to do my presentation on Dr. Paul Erdos, and I have to admit I never heard that name before. I even went through the entire textbook, and it turns out he was mentioned. It was one tiny line, and so I never would have heard of the guy, and I guess I never would have known anything about him at all. But I did a little bit of research. I wanted to try to find somebody just a little bit different. Of course, I was thinking about a lot of the famous names, Descartes and Euclid and so forth. But I just I felt like it might be more interesting to try something off the beaten path. And it's kind of funny because that's exactly, it turns out, what this man's life was about. Dr. Paul Erdos from Hungary, born in 1913, and died in 1996, actually. So a pretty recent figure. And the book was entitled My Brain is Open. It came from a line that he would say. It turns out he worked with a lot of different people, and that would be one of his lines he would use when meeting somebody. Hey, my brain is open, and let's get to work. Basically, I mean, he was not the type of person that would close himself up in a room and just do math. He loved to work with others. He thought of it as a social activity. He was born in Hungary to Anna and Lajos Erdos. He's Jewish. Another reason why I guess I kind of was interested, being Jewish, I kind of wanted to learn a little bit about his plight. And it turns out a lot of it does have to do, his life with being Jewish. It had something to do with it, although he wasn't religious. In fact, he was adamant in being non-religious, but the fact that he was Jewish would have a lot to do with his life. Growing up, he did have early trauma with his siblings. Two siblings died, leaving him the only child, and his parents just doted on him, especially his mom. Tremendously overprotective, and up until her dying days, she would follow him around, and she didn't let him tie his own shoelaces until the age of 11. He never learned to do things like just simple chores, making his own food. There was an interesting story about how when he first went to college in England, he had to butter his own toast, and he was unable to do that effectively at first. He had to kind of sit there and figure it out. So there he is with his mom. And eventually, due to war and persecution of Jews, he did end up in England, and here he is pictured in a group of mathematicians. And there's Dr. Erdos. He ended up in England and eventually becoming a doctor of math at 21. And due to the fact that there was such persecution of Jews, he had a feeling that he would end up having to leave Hungary for good and not be able to come back. And that's actually what happened in the late 30s, early 40s. He ended up getting a position at Princeton, so he had a chance to work where Einstein worked, actually. But it just seems to be the nature of Erdős' life. He ended up having to leave Princeton only after about a year and a half. Basically that's what started his roaming around the country. He found a lot of pleasure in working with others, so he just would go to friends' houses, travel in the middle of the night, knocking on doors, waking people up and saying, hey, my brain is open and let's get to work. And he would work with pretty much anybody. He didn't care, young, old, and in fact, he loved children. He would call them epsilons, due to the fact that epsilon was the mathematical representation of extremely small quantities. And so he would work with so many people. In fact, it was estimated after his death that over 500 collaborators would work with Dr. Erdos on different papers. And in his lifetime, he published almost 1,500 articles. So even though we do hear a lot about Euler and his production, it turns out that in just purely mathematical terms, Erdos actually produced more. Euler was also involved in a lot of the sciences, so even though his total output might be more, Erdos is actually the most prolific author. And yet it's funny, I've never heard of him, and it's fascinating going through his life and realizing how many things he did. Even though we may not be able to attribute so many different theorems and things to him, he did have a lot to do with basically cleaning up a lot of old theorems, which became kind of a pastime among people involved in higher math, not necessarily always proving something new, but cleaning things up and making them more readable. And he did that with one of the more famous things, the prime number theorem. Unfortunately, that did get him into a little bit of controversy, again, getting back to some of the things I learned about recently, about priority of discovery, where he worked on this process of cleaning up the proof, but it turned out that another mathematician had the makings of the proof, and Erdos helped him out. These things are so difficult to untangle, and going back, it seems like one of these cases where it's really difficult to find out who really did come up with it first, and I don't think anyone's ever really been able to figure it all out. Erdos was the type of person that just said, hey, let's work on it together, let's put both of our names on it. After all, he pretty much started this trend of collaboration in math, working with over 500 people. But Selberg, who was the Scandinavian mathematician, just wouldn't have any part of it. He wanted to receive sole credit. He was not a collaborator. And so this was really the only controversy that he was ever involved in. But that was not what math meant to him. He wanted to have collaboration with as many people as possible. And for him, it was just all about proving the math. His philosophy was life was about proving and conjecturing. That's what he was into. So when he did leave Europe with the rising anti-Semitism and the war coming, unfortunately a lot of his friends and collaborators, family members, did die in the Holocaust. So it ended up forcing him to move around to different countries, and that became his life. Moving around is a fascinating journey. From door to door, it almost seemed like he would find new people, stay there a week or two, move on. So what kinds of math did he actually work on? A lot of this stuff, it's things I'm only just beginning to just barely understand, but he was involved in combinatorics, graph theory. Some of the things that were thought of as just kind of make-believe math when he first came up with it. Ramsey numbers, theories that have to do with things that seem like nonsense, random graphs. He was working on a paper where it started out with just such a simple concept. What if somebody was to come up with just some random graph? You just draw lines in between 2 points, like connecting two cities, roads connecting two random cities, and just some weird idea like that, and it turned into this long paper. And the next thing you know, we had people that were using this theory for things like how does traffic work, and even the origins of life, due to some of the theories that he came up with these random graphs, where when you get to more than half of, let's say, these random cities being connected, something happens, a shift happens, and all of a sudden, almost like water when it freezes, you have almost like a chain reaction, which in some ways could provide the answers to the origins of life. It's something that when they first sat down to think about it, probably wasn't in their mind, but Erdos started with this basic idea of what if you just had this random graph, and it turned out to be something huge. So it's a fascinating journey through the life of a totally different and eccentric person. In one biography, he was called the man who loved only numbers. It probably has a little bit to do with the fact that he had a self-professed abnormality where it made it either impossible or difficult for him to engage in any kind of sexual activity. So, certainly an eccentric and unusual individual, but his likability, his sociability matches no other with sitting down and doing math as a social activity. Is just unbelievable, and leading to a whole new way of looking at math, and not just wanting to claim credit selfishly for everything, and being willing to give up the credit. In fact, a lot of times he would be involved in writing a paper with somebody and give all the credit to the other individual. There's one famous story where an Indian mathematician wrote an article proving something in a journal, and it turned out it was something that Erdos and an associate had already done maybe 5-6 years before that. And Erdos, instead of doing what maybe Gauss would do and say, hey, I did that first, I want all the credit, he did the exact opposite. He just said, oh yeah, no, that's a good job, good for you. And he never did volunteer that he was actually the one that proved it. So a very different take on math and how it's done. His influence is still being felt today with people that he collaborated throughout his long life, are still proving things with the knowledge that they gained from Erdos. So we may see even more papers in the future that are influenced by him. So the number may even go up. The last was just over 1,500 articles and over 500 collaborators, but who knows, that may still go up. So a fascinating journey, and like I say, something that I never would have known about. Again, well worth reading. My Brain is Open by Bruce Schechter. Thanks for watching.